I'd like to welcome you to my Thursday Bread History Seminar Workshop. I am broadcasting from my kitchen in Santa Cruz, California. My name is William Rubel. You can find my book, Bread, A Global History, at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and other online sources, possibly also at your public library. I'm writing a larger bread history, and really this work in the seminar series is feeding into this new work that I'm writing. So thank you very much for watching. You can go to my Facebook group, Bread History in Practice, join the group. That's where you will get notifications of the live seminars, and also you will see what people are posting who have attended the seminar. If you want to make breads that are mentioned, then go to my website, williamrubel.com. I don't have all of the recipes from each of these seminars posted, but increasingly I do. So you should look there first in the category seminar. Now I always start with the same two slides. And so I'm going to do that now. Bread is an invention, like a chair, a car, a shoe, or a necklace. Bread is not an agricultural crop. No farmer ever picked a bread from a tree, dug a bread from the ground like a potato, or harvested it from a vine like a pea or a bean or a kiwi. Everything about bread is an invention of culture. What grain to grow, how finely to grind it, whether to further refine that flour, and if so, how refined, whether to make a big loaf, a small one, whether to make a flat bread, or whether a loaf bread, whether to have a thick crust, a thin crust, whether to have a fine crumb or an open crumb. All of that is an invention. It just doesn't exist in nature. Today, we have a guest lecturer, Jeff Pavlik, and he's going to be talking about a very specific bread, the ship's biscuit. And that is a very specific kind of bread invention. Now, when you look up in the stars at night, you see lots of patterns and lots of pictures. There's Cassiopeia, there's the Big Dipper, this Little Dipper. But what's not there is the recipe for the best bread. It's just missing, because the recipe for the best bread is in our hearts. And the bread that Jeff is going to be talking about today is one of the most important breads in history. And it's also one that basically nobody thinks about anymore. It's a bread that possibly also nobody ever looked up in the sky expecting to find the recipe for the best ship's biscuit. So without more ado, I turn you over to Jeff.
My name is Jeff Pavlik. I am a professional baker here at, welcome to my bakery. This is Sunflower Bakehouse in Farmington, Michigan. Michigan is in the Great Lakes, and we're right outside of Detroit, Michigan. We're a suburb that was founded in the 1820s of Detroit. I bought this bakery 22 years ago. And after having studied at the University of Missouri, I have a degree in United States history, as well as another degree in peace studies, studying conflict resolution and social movement history. And with those degrees, I became a baker. It was supposed to be a short-term goal to make some money and utilize my youth to, use the energy that I had to build capital and move on in my life. And we ended up staying here. This pandemic, COVID, has been honestly amazing for us. We've done fantastic. Our customers trust us. We have a really broad community of support. They trust our baking, they trust our family, and they line up down the street when to buy our baked goods, which is, as a baker, probably one of the something that is you can't quantify, and you can only reproduce it literally every day. And that's something about baking that all of you might know that are bakers, that it's about the reproduction, that getting the same skills down every day and keeping it on track. I want to talk to you all today about ship's biscuits. They are the simplest of breads, but yet so complicated. The more you look into them, the more you realize that there's a lot of intricacies to them. One of the things also I want to do in this presentation is kind of debunk a lot of the repetitiveness of the internet. The internet has spawned a whole cottage industry of ship's biscuits and hardtack recipes. Most of them are wrong. They just aren't based on solid documentation. So I want to go through and show you all the documentation, show you where I get my opinions from based on what was written at the time, not what we're reading in 2021. You also find that a lot of the things that you read are all just copy and paste. And because it's copy and paste, no one can back up some of this information. So I'm hoping that if nothing else, you'll become educated so that when you read some of the most brilliant museum pieces out there are just wrong. Some of the books on the topic just seem to miss the point. And some of the notion that all these breads are the same also misses the point. So we're going to take a journey through ship's biscuits. The amazing thing about ship's biscuits that's different than almost every other bread is that we can still see it. We can see a loaf of bread from hundreds of years ago. Most bread is consumed, or it molds or turns to dust. Ship's biscuits were designed to do neither, and so they're still around. And it's actually kind of fascinating that you can look at a piece of bread that's hundreds of years old. And you can learn a lot about the techniques of milling. You can learn about the techniques of baking. And you can think about, why did they make this? Why did they do this? And they had an incredible purpose. And it was survival. It was a way in which the human can continue to eat the grains that we so love. And this made it portable and kept its longevity, and so that we could keep it into posterity. We still have them. I'm going to run through this PowerPoint. It's way too big, but it's also incredibly interesting as far as the amount and variety of things that I'm going to be throwing at you. So if you have any questions, please wait till the end and we'll jot them down. But I'm hoping to give you like maybe a 14,000 year history real briefly of where we are today. I'd like to first read this. It's a poem, hardtack. Call it what you will, sea or ship or pilot's biscuit. Either way, it's flour and water. A tasteless concoction a sailor stacks like poker chips inside his cap and then devours. As if storm and wave tossed in the high seas, he were the high stakes game he hoped to win. When you're a sailor starving, existing on a staple of saltless hardtack, when all you can see is a sea of salt and the salt of other men, or in the blistering winds, the salt of your own tears, there's little to win. When you bite your tongue, when the captain hurls another insult, when he unfurls the tip of his dark whip, you bite down hard on the hardtack, pretending it's his hand, which doesn't feed you. You bite down on the weevils and the mold inherent in the hardtack, in the cracker as hard as the whole ware exhausted. You fall between your hard and salt-caked mates, each in his own despair, each in his own self-remedying dream, the scent of earth, urgent incontinence from salt-sung air. This poem is probably one of the most accurate pieces of writing of the 21st century. This was written in 2010, but it's really right on. The poet, Andrea Cohen, is actually a very accomplished poet, and I was blown away that she wrote something A, so meaningful, and B, so accurate. So this is my working definition. Ship's biscuits are usually unleavened bread made with only flour and water, shaped flat and baked till hard, set to dry for long-term storage and utilized primarily by sailors, armies, travelers, and explorers. It is eaten by breaking it into smaller pieces and soaking it in liquid. I'd like to add that the predecessor of the Oxford English Dictionary, the New English Dictionary of Historical Principles in 1888, wrote, "The current biscuit is a senseless adoption of the modified French spelling without the French pronunciation." I find that funny. This is a flowchart that I use to put this presentation together. The word ship's biscuit, hard bread, seed biscuit, hardtack, rusk, cracker, they all start to meld together. And when people write about this, they just mix and match them because they're almost similar enough to be interchangeable, but they're not. This starts at the Neolithic era, let's just say plus or minus 12,000 BCE, when we have unleavened grains smashed down and baked on a rock. It fits our purpose. It's an unleavened bread baked till dry for travel and storage. Or they could have just eaten it right then. The next time that we see this sort of bread is in the Roman era. I'm going to slaughter the Romans so you can read it. And then that bread is a hard bread, distinctive in that it's designed for soldiers and sailors and people on the move. The English form changes quite a bit through the centuries. Biscotti, biscuit. And then by the 17th and 18th century, we start seeing the word ship's biscuit and seed biscuit, ship's bread, and hard bread. This bread is sifted to some extent. In the 19th century, the Americans utilize more white flour, and they start making what they call pilot biscuits. Pilot biscuits devolve into another American word, hardtack. That hardtack is also known as biscuits and also now known as crackers. That's mostly white flour. On the other side are the luxury cakes, biscuits, crackers, and cookies. These have salt, sugar, leaveners, milk, egg, fruit, seeds, and spices. So this idea of a small piece of bread starts breaking up, and we get this whole world of biscuits, which doesn't have anything to do with the sea biscuit we're going to talk to, other than they obviously share the name and they share some of the properties, but we see a different line of the family tree. As well as we have the graham cracker, which is a whole grain cracker that was formed in Michigan, actually, not far from where I'm at, and that is another form of whole grain hard cracker. The French took a different take. They actually leavened these sea biscuits, different than the unleavened breads that we'll be talking about. And from the leavened breads, we have a whole other line called the rusks, the biscottis, the zwiebacks. These are leavened breads cut and then baked twice. Biscuit meaning to bake twice. These are the only actual twice baked breads that we'll be talking about, are this offshoot of an offshoot. I added this because it's kind of confusing, and I think this is just really funny. So as the Oxford English Dictionary blog put it a couple years ago, so you got it right. A British biscuit is an American cookie, and an American cookie is a British cookie, but an American biscuit is a British scone, and an American scone is something entirely different. Right? Simple. I think that sums up some of the confusion in language. The first unleavened bread that we're going to come across is, of course, what we now know as matzah. The Jews leaving Egypt baked an unleavened bread that they brought forth out of Egypt. This fits this definition of an unleavened bread for travelers. So I'm going to include it in this initial history, that we can think back to these unleavened breads that cultures still take part in. This is that Latin word for hard bread, and the soldiers themselves were called bucellari. I say slaughter Latin, which literally meant biscuit eater. One of the earliest English references that puts the words bread and ships and biscuit all together is here in the text. How can I get rid of this? There we go. Thank you. Is it here in the text of Nicole Trevet, who had written his stories before 1400. They were the basis for a lot of the Canterbury Tales. And he says that this manner of bread, which they call the biscuit, and they're putting it on a ship. These ship biscuits at this time were important to, of course, what was happening in our city-states, nations, and monarchies. We were exploring, we were expanding, we were looking for new lands for colonization, we were looking for new resources, and we were looking for shorter routes to the trade goods that we both wanted to get access to, as well as new markets that we needed to exploit for the benefit of the state. And so in this era of 1487 through really now, we start traveling. And in order to travel on the sea, you need to have a food that's going to last. The sea biscuit fit that perfectly. But not all of them, like I said, were these harder round biscuits. Some were rusks. Rusk, as Benjamin Franklin says, rusk is the true original biscuit, prepared to keep for the sea. It is in signifying by the French, twice baked. We also see that Sir Drake in 1595 took a provision, 7 or 8 cakes of biscuit or rusk. Again, provision for the ship. Stedman was working on slave ships in Africa in the 1770s. He says he swallowed his dram upon being awoke with a piece of dry rusk biscuit for breakfast, and he marched on. So what do you do with this dry rusk biscuit? It's made a coarse loaf of rye, cut in two, baked as hard as stone. I had to break it with my fusil, which is a French for a musket, and I was glad to eat it, though mold it and impregnate it with worms, spiders, gravel, and even broken bottles. I don't know what bakery that came from, but that's some crazy stuff right there. Of course, it's written about in literature. Robinson Crusoe, he takes his bread, I mean his biscuit. My bread, I mean the biscuit. And he also says that it's 1 cake of bread a day. So here we have the term bread, biscuit, and cake, all meaning the same piece that he's eating. This is a seaport scene from Vernet. This could be anywhere in the 1750s that was colonized by the European powers. Huge ship ports with people coming in and out, loading and unloading these ships. The provisions for these ships was imperative to make sure they can get from point A to point B. This is an era of proto-industrialization, of colonization, mercantilism. These all demanded a sea power that would enable the state to survive. This is a time of conquest of empires. The sea biscuit allowed for their men to man these ships and travel the world. But it wasn't always very good ration. Sometimes the food was bad. Sometimes it was just unorganized. The logistics were off. People were getting hungry. And so the British in 1667, they standardized the ration for a sailor. It would be 1 pound of good, clean, sweet, sound, well bolted with a horse cloth, well baked and well conditioned wheaten biscuit. So before the 17th century, we know that we are talking about wheat biscuits. We also know that they're well bolted. Bolting flour means to sift it. So every time that you read hardtack or sea biscuit, whole wheat flour, it's not whole wheat flour. It's sifted flour. We'll talk about it later, but even from the beginning, when we have our best, earliest descriptions, they're already sifted. And the most important thing about biscuits that personally drives me crazy when I see recipes on the internet is they'll say, oh, take a cup or 2 of flour and you add, this amount of water, and you add some salt, which we'll talk about later. And then you mix it all up, you cut it, and then you bake it. And that will make a dry bread, no doubt about it. But in order to maintain a sailor's life on a ship in the middle of the ocean, he needed to be guaranteed that there would be enough food to get from point A to point B. And that meant rationing. That meant knowing how much food was going on the ship before it left port, dividing that by the number of days they hoped to be at sea, and then making sure that when food was distributed, each person got their daily amount. You can't do that if you're just willy-nilly throwing biscuits out and say, take some. Because someone's going to take too many and you're going to run out. So in general, they were divided and scaled so that a certain amount would equal the ration. In the British Navy, generally, they were 1 pound rations, and that would be 5 biscuits. So this is 5 biscuits of the different sorts that I showed you how to make. This would be 1 day's ration. It's not a willy-nilly, guesstimate of to how much bread a man gets. They get 5 biscuits. Each of these weighs just over 3 ounces times 5 is 16 ounces, is 1 pound. this is what you're guaranteed on the ship per day. And this goes for soldiers, sailors, and other people that were guaranteed rations as part of their job. So whenever you see a recipe that doesn't state the end weight and how much it weighs per total amount, they're not thinking about sea biscuits as a ration good. They're just thinking about making bread, flour and water, and drying it out, which is interesting, but it's not the point. The point is that they were rationed, and therefore they have to be a specific weight. Like I said, not all biscuits were unleavened. The French had their own technique. They were very proud of it. The biscuit, according to Malian, is we have always made bread that keeps in long sea voyages, in war, and in sieges. That's what they're for. They're for long sea voyages, soldiers, and conquest. The marine biscuit is baked twice. So the French word actually makes a little bit more sense in France. It's baked twice for short trips and 4 times for long trips. It's made of wheat flour purified of the bran, meaning once again, it's been sifted, it's been bolted. It's not whole wheat flour. And they change by saying that they start with 14 ounces of dough and they reduce it down to 8 or 9 ounces. But if you notice on the top, the ration is 1.5 pounds, meaning 3 biscuits equals a daily ration. They're slightly larger, and instead of getting 5, you get 3. And your ration, because the French love their bread, is a little bigger. I don't want you to think this just took place on the ocean. Here's 2 comparisons about the same time. On the left is North America during what we call the French and Indian War. We have a French aide-de-camp to the commander of the French forces that says that the 4 ovens are now working to make 3,500 rations per day. The 6 cannot start until Tuesday. They'll make 5,500. There are 120 sacks of biscuits making 4,000 rations of 1.5 pounds each. The French, they like their 1.5 pounds a ration, whether you're at sea or on land. They're going to report tomorrow about the daily rations. And here's the interesting thing. These biscuits are not just for sailors. They're not just for soldiers. They're for officers, servants, and Indians. The Native American people, the indigenous people in North America, were also eating these biscuits. So while we think about a jolly English sailor, true, but also a Native American living in the Great Lakes fighting with the French against the English is also eating a hardened loaf of bread. On the other side of the world, during one of the many Russo-Ottoman campaigns, this area that was fought over for so long with the Ottoman Empire and the Austrian-Hungarian empires and the Russian empires. Here, this is where now, like modern-day Romania, this man finds in a castle on the Danube 300 kantar of biscuit, which, if I understand kantar, means there's 300,000 pounds. I don't know about that, but it's a lot, obviously. And the important thing is that they're still pure, white, and edible, and they were left over from the 1738-39 campaign. This is 30 years later, 1768. So 30 years later, he finds these biscuits are still dry and edible. And this is happening with the peoples that are the Ottoman Empire, the Russian or the Austrian Empire, the Native Americans, the British, and the French. At the same time period, are all eating ship's biscuits. During the American Revolution, they were eaten by the soldiers here in America. George Washington said that if there's an emergency, they need hard bread, it can't be found, just give them flour. They'll figure this out. They'll end up going Neolithic and baking it on rocks. Meanwhile, a soldier was walking through the street. There's a cask of sea biscuits, and he says that they were made, I believe, of canal and peas meal, nearly hard enough for musket flints. They were hard enough to break the teeth of a rat. He says canal. What is canal? Canal is a mixture of coarser particles of flour and fine bran, shorts, or feed, now usually known as shorts, feed, or finished middlings. This man recognized that the biscuits were not just merely wheat biscuits. They weren't merely white biscuits. They weren't whole wheat biscuits. They had something different in them. He says that it tasted like there was pea flour, and there's also this thing called canal or middlings. And he recognized that. It was common enough. This is a biscuit from a sailor, just to give you the idea of what one might look like in your hand. This one is from 1784. This one gives the dimensions of 3 3/4 inches by 7/16 inches thick, or 10 millimeters by 95 millimeters. That's this size here. These are all that size. So when you're looking at this picture, this is basically the size that I replicate. Here's another one that's slightly bigger, 12 centimeters. Some rationing was 5 to a pound, other was 4 to a pound. So this one probably was a 4 to the pound ration. It was slightly bigger and had that distributive ounce throughout it. And it's marked with the king's mark, crow fit, the phenon. It meant property of the majesty of the king. And you can see on ours, they're marked with that crow foot. You can also see these prisoners marked with it. They're property of the king. This biscuit press is very similar to mine here. This is a reproduction of that biscuit press. This is a docker. This is what you press on the biscuit. It puts the holes in the biscuit for evaporation. It also marks it as king's property. And most importantly, it has a W. The W means that it comes from the Royal William Yard in Plymouth. There's accountability to these. While we'll talk about all the weevils and we'll talk about how, these things were all full of bugs and they were nasty and moldy, they were labeled so that you knew who made it. If they were full of weevils and bugs and you got them from W, then the purser, the person who purchased the goods for the ship, can go back to W and say, your goods, I need my money back. So there's an accountability in this system in the Royal Navy, one that we often overlook because we love weevils, because the story is just so great, I guess. This particular picture comes from Robert Riding, who's a commander of the Supplies and Transport Naval at the Ministry of Defense in London in the 70s, 80s, maybe longer, I'm not sure. He became a renowned expert in ship's biscuits. When you read Wikipedia or you read unattributed things that you can't ever source out, more than likely they came from this man. I like to thank Jeff Nichols. I don't know if he's listening, but he's an assistant archivist at the Chopsam Museum in Exeter. I happened to read his piece, which was excellent, and I thought, this guy knows something that most people don't. So I looked, and he at least sourced that he was getting it from these papers. He was so generous and sent me those papers a couple weeks ago. And these are all personal notes from this commander whose whole job it was to put together provisions for the modern Royal Navy. He was fascinated by ship's biscuits, and you can tell we were kindred spirits in this. He didn't put a lot of explanation as to where he was getting his sourcing, but I can now know that when I read things that I can't source, at least I source it back to a man who was passionate about what he was learning. I wish he would have done a better job, of course, of noting where he got some of this information, but so much of it is so dead on that I tend to trust a lot of what he says. I have to go through now and look at all the articles that I've dismissed because they were unattributed and find out how closely they compare. But I see a lot of information about ship's biscuits is actually coming from several pages of his personal notes and articles that he published. And that's what research is about, right? That's what we do. As historians, we're tracing down how do we know what we think we know. This is one way to know it. You find the actual artifact. So once again, this is a possibly 18th century biscuit press, early 19th century for sure, that I had gotten reproduced by a blacksmith in Maine several years ago. And it's called a docker. Biscuit dockers came in different shapes. If you had a smaller biscuit that wasn't per se for the military, there's different shapes of dockers. The process of making biscuits, we can look at a 1590s and an 1890s biscuit making process. Now the men on the left that are making bread, that image is not of them per se making biscuits, but you might note that they are dividing, rolling, and then stamping them, and then loading them in the oven. I don't know what they're making, but it sure has a lot of similarities to biscuit making. So one of my big pet peeves, you read something on the internet and it says add whole wheat flour, add water, and add salt. I'm going to try to explain to you no salt. I read something on the internet that was, I was just like, wow, this guy gets it. Said salt's very important in the process of making risen bread. It helps bind gluten. It helps control the shape, control fermentation, better flavor, maintain moisture. But none of these virtues are required for a biscuit. It's such a mainstay in bread making that it's made its way into the modern interpretations of ship's biscuits without any merit. Biscuit makers of the period were well informed of the detrimental effects of salt in a biscuit and were advised not to use salt. I, one late night, read that and thought, man, awesome. And then I realized that I had written it and someone else had just copied and pasted and put it on their website. And I guess that's one of the beauties of passing along information. But here are some period references. It's baked twice without leaven or salt. It's excellent for the use of the sea because baked without salt, it's well dried. Do not use salt. Salt can make it more likely to attract moisture from the air. Hard bread baked without salt in the form of crackers until dry is quite imperishable if kept from moisture. All of these references point to no salt. You'll see it in so many, almost every recipe. Don't use it. So this is the pilot biscuit. It is an adaptation of the ship's biscuit made in America in the late 18th century. It was a whiter flour version of the ship's biscuit, a little bit thinner. It was used not only to provision ships going on the Atlantic Ocean, but it was also used by the populace. It became popular to eat a sort of pilot biscuit with your meal. You could buy them, store them, and have them. You use them quite like the sailors did. You had to dunk them in liquid. So one of the recipes that's famous in this area of New England is, of course, New England clam chowder, which originally didn't have the potatoes in it, but it did have a large helping of pilot biscuits or ship's biscuits. We can see at the bottom an 1890s recipe for these pilot breads. This is 100 years later, and they're using flour, butter, saltpeter and tartric acid, which combined makes baking powder, and then water. No salt, and you're adding the butter for a nicer, crisper cracker, really. They're making crackers, but they're calling them pilot bread. This is an unfinished slide. Okay, so this was different foods that they were eating with these biscuits. New England clam chowder, lobcoos, which is a dish on the high seas in which you would take bits of meat and fish, your vegetables, anything that the purser was giving you to eat, you're adding it into water and then you're putting your biscuits in them. You have to break up the biscuits, soak them in there in order to eat them. In order to eat any of these biscuits, you have to soak them in some sort of liquid. In the Civil War, skill galley was taking fat salt pork and frying it up and then adding the biscuit to it to make to moisten the bread with fat. Salt pork and peas was both on the naval ships as well as throughout the armies marching all around the world. But you make a pea soup and then you take your biscuit and you throw it in the pea soup. It softens it up and you eat those together. Of course, you can dunk it in coffee, rum, or beer. All three of those were rationed on ships, or even water. As Gulliver's Travels, Jonathan Swift wrote in Gulliver's Travel, if the captain had not allowed me some of his best biscuit, which rubbed to powder and mingled with water, was their constant food. So their food is take this, crumble it up, soak it up, and then you're drinking basically a carbohydrate shake. Weevils, we all like to talk about them. Here we go. I know this is what everyone seems to love. The weevils that you see in this picture are biscuit beetles, those little brown things. Those biscuit beetles are called biscuit beetles in the UK. In America, we call them drugstore beetles. They find their way into dry goods, flour, bread, cereal products, grains, and they produce small larvae, which are almost indistinguishable to the human eye. You don't eat the larvae. I mean, you eat them, but you don't know you're eating the larva. You might, though, end up seeing these small black flecks, which are the grown beetles called bread beetles or biscuit beetles. The worm that everyone likes to talk about is the cadile beetle. It's also known as a bargeman because they could just barge out of the biscuit right when you're wanting to take a bite of it. or if you're putting all the bread on the table, they all just kind of move aside. They're the white beetle larva with the black head that people kind of think look like mealworms. When they grow up, they look big and black and quite like a cockroach. So sometimes you'll read that the cockroaches were infesting when they're really the Cadile beetle. Now, none of these are weevils, right? None of these are weevils. And in fact, the Cadile beetle was not eating the biscuit. The Cadile beetle was eating the biscuit beetle. That was eating the biscuit. So this animal eats that animal, which eats that piece of bread. This happened, don't get me wrong. One of my favorite pieces of literature about this comes from 1748, The Adventures of Roger Grantham, in which he says he's coming out of a port in New England, right? So he's not getting British naval provisions. He's getting just random place. And he says that the sailors gave the putrid salt beef the name Irish horse, the salt pork of New England, which was neither fish nor flesh, the bread from the same country, every biscuit whereof, like a piece of clockwork, moved by its own internal impulse, occasioned by the myriads of insects that dwelt within it. That's pretty gross. I get it. And those stores happened. This is not an unknown thing, having bugs in your bread. What's true, though, is that the sailors, the ships, they all prevented it the best they could. No one wants this. We now kind of fetishize the trauma of it, and we talk about it, but no one was looking for this. The Dutch and the French started putting their biscuits in wooden casks. That helped a lot. The British favored putting theirs in cloth bags and storing them in the bottom hold so they could get air. Well, that air was full of salt and humidity, which was a perfect breeding ground for these bugs. They didn't do really, it took them a long time to catch on. But once they caught on, they put their biscuits in tin-lined crates, and then later tins. That, of course, now is still carried on, that we go to the store and we buy a tin of biscuits. It's just that simple. This is my own observation. Oh, we talked about this earlier, but let's talk about this. The biscuits were all marked, so you knew where they came from. And most times the beetles were coming from the bakery. They're not necessarily living always on the ship. They just carried in through flour. Even in modern times, beetles are carried in through modern flour. This is my own observation. I've observed that the most commonly complained about thing in life is food in a place you don't want to be. Airports, schools or work cafeterias, your mean aunt's house, wars, long voyages at sea. And soldiers and sailors love to reminisce about bad food. I think it's to deal with the trauma of a regulated life civilians will never understand. You'll never understand what it was like to be in war or to be on the high seas, but you might have a sense of what it's like to have maybe bugs in your food. And somehow or another that lessens the experience that they had, but they can share it together. The British sign language for biscuit is to knock the weevils out. Pretty awesome. Let's jump back to North America. The voyageurs, these are the men that went on the paddled the canoes. They're not boats, but their canoes are on the water. Long voyages into the great interior of the Great Lakes, the Hudson Bay, out to towards the Pacific Ocean. They were rationed biscuits as well. The original voyageurs were French. They later were once the French lost their colony in North America, the British took over the fur trade. An interesting research paper that has to be written still is, did the biscuits change? Were they French biscuits or British biscuits? How were they making their biscuits? We don't know, but it's a fascinating way in which cultures of bread change despite the fact that like the actual work still goes on. This is a biscuit that I talked about on our Facebook page. It's from the Fury. This is a partially eaten biscuit. What's amazing about this biscuit is that it was abandoned by the Fury, and then some 10 years later, one of the sailors that was on the ship knew where it was, went back to it where they had stored the food and cached it there, went back and grabbed a biscuit. That man actually went to the North Pole, the first guy to do it. He says that this biscuit went to the North Pole. I'm not 100% sure, but meanwhile, this piece of bread has seen a lot. The other end, we have in North America this incredible expanse of land which we haven't explored. One of the first people to go west in the 1830s was George Pantlin. He was a painter. This is one of his paintings of what was happening out in the West. And he carried with him a coffee pot, a tin cup, tied with a few pounds of hard biscuits in his portmanteau. So whether or not we're exploring for North Pole or we're just trying to go and see what it looks like in the American West, people are carrying biscuits. This here is a six-sided ship's biscuit. It's interesting because it's not round. You can see that it's from Devonport Depot because it has a D on it. You can see the crowfoot. These biscuits were coming out of a mechanical era of the 1830s. Biscuit making went from hand production to machinery. They say that by the 1850s, they talk about the ovens. They're 4.5 feet wide, 26 feet in length. All 4 ovens, one above each other. They can contain as much as 650 biscuits, and they can make 2,600 biscuits in an hour, a ton every 2 hours. And these are actually cut on a machine, a rolling machine. They're hexagonal because they don't lose any dough. Because these shapes, if you took a bunch of hexagons and put them together, it loses nothing. It's the most efficient way to make a shaped biscuit. They could, of course, been square, but I think these are just so beautiful. So you make them by, first of all, mixing your flour and water, and then you have to break it. To break means to knead, but this dough has such a low level of hydration, so little water that they were using what they called a breaking horse or a biscuit break. And basically, it's a swivel on a board. You put your dough on there, and you bounce up and down. This is how it's been done from the 1600s, 1700s, up and through the 1800s, and really up until the 1900s, until modern mixers are invented. This style of making bread continued. Here's some more images to help you understand what they would look like. These are called breaks. When they finally made more mechanized equipment to pump these biscuits out, you'll see that this particular biscuit machine from the 1850s has an extra roller with it attached for breaking the dough. So breaking the dough, meaning to mix it and to stretch it out to try to make it lighter, and you're trying to make that dough, that gluten, you're trying to stretch it without a lot of water, and it's going to lighten it up, the inside lighten it up. We call that breaking the dough, but the term comes from the break, which was the machine. And this is where we get sheet iron crackers. By the 1850s, a rotisserie oven was figured out, what you call a real oven. Real ovens are still used. This is mine. You'll see that in the background thing spinning. That thing just keeps going and going and going. This is a Middleby Marshall. It was made sometime in the 50s. The company itself was established in 1888. Unfortunately, the company went out of business about 10 years ago. This oven actually has a purchaser. If I want to sell this oven today, a company will come out, take this oven apart, move it, and then rebuild it for someone that you want it. Because these things were so well built that they just don't go bad. But because they don't go bad, no one needed a second oven. So the company went under after over 100 years. This is how it goes when you build something well. But this real oven uses sheet pans in and out of it. So the term sheet iron cracker or hardtack came from the machinery as well. Now we're in the 1850s, which for Americans means the American Civil War. I found this document yesterday, and something caught my eye about it. And first of all, it lists different types of pilot bread. You have thick pilot bread, thin pilot bread, and crackers, all being sold on the same day by the same person. This is a receipt to pay for a receipt because they took all these pieces of hard bread and sent them to Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, which is the capital of Pennsylvania. Troops were being stationed at Harrisburg at the capital because 9 days earlier, the American Civil War had started. Now, things not to do on the day after an inauguration, or maybe yesterday was the inauguration. Don't type in when is U.S. Civil War, okay? Just don't do it. If I get pulled over by the FBI, please know that you can do a thorough Google search and see that I was trying to figure out what day the original Civil War was in 1861. It started on August 12th. But you can see from this document that they distinguish thick, thin, regular, and crackers. These are all not the same thing. These are all for American soldiers in the Civil War. None of it's called hardtack. Not yet. The term hardtack existed, but the bakery was still calling it pilot bread. But here is what we call hardtack. It's about 3 inches by 3 inches, made with mechanized ovens, mechanized breakers. These things can be pumped out very quickly, and they survive. Here's one from 1864. The term hardtack first appears in English in 1836, softtack in 1833. Supposedly, the word tack is slang by sailors for food. Can't find it. I don't know where they're coming up with that, but that's what they say. What we do know is that by the 1830s, the term tack is being used to describe these hard breads, or by bread, hard and soft. This is a funny song about hardtack. It just basically says that you've lingered on my stomach sore, oh hardtack, come again no more. But when I'm dying of starvation, oh hardtack, come again once more. You are old and wormy, we passed your failings over, oh hardtack, come again once more. So they're talking about wormy hardtack, but this song supposedly was written in 1861 in June. So like 2 months after the Civil War started, they're already complaining about the food. But what was that bread? People use the term hardtack and chips biscuits interchangeably. I say that we think about what did the Army say about their hard bread, what we would call hardtack, but they were calling hard bread. It's made of super fine white flour, sometimes even extra fine. It should be crispy, white, flaky when broken, if salt is used. Not salt is used, if salt is used, so it could be. But they've shown that their best bread only lasts for 3 months. He then says that the terms fancy, extra superfine, and middlings for flour just don't matter anymore. That they don't distinguish that kind of grinding because grinding wheat had changed. There is a recipe from the 1890s that talks about hardtack and chips biscuits. It has salt in it. Every bushel of flour, you add 6 ounces of salt. Bushel of flour is 60 pounds, 50 pounds, 45 pounds. I mean, you can, one way or the other, we're talking about a minuscule amount of salt. So when you read a recipe that has like 1 or 2 cups of flour and a tablespoon of salt or a teaspoon of salt, all that, teaspoons are way too big to be making. Unless you're making 10 pounds of flour, you want to stay away from any but just the slightest pinch if it's even necessary. They're saying it's not necessary. It might not even be in the recipe. But again, this modern notion of putting salt in bread is so ingrained in us that we keep doing it despite what the documents say. Can the bread be improved? An author wrote a whole piece about can we make this bread better? He says that part of the problem is when you lean back and on your pack, or you put your pack down too hard, you crush the hardtack. So sailors are complaining that you have to smash the hardtack with a frying pan in order to break it. The officers are saying, well, look, they're really fragile. We need to make them harder. It goes back and forth. But one of the things that he says to be improved is that the world has shown that unbolted meal is a healthier source of food than the superfine flour. So he's going back. Why shouldn't we go back to unbolted meal? So for centuries, we're using barely bolted meal, not unbolted, but barely bolted meal. He's saying, let's go back to that this white flour cracker is not serving its purpose. Also, he says that unbolted wheat meal will not keep because it becomes sour at common temperatures. There's this whole anti-whole wheat thing going on. People, even today, love their white flour. So wheat flour is oftentimes disparaged, except for if you're a guy named Graham. Graham loved unsifted flour, whole wheat flour. He made something called a graham cracker here in Michigan, and he was a health nut. He was a nut in general. Why do I include graham crackers? Because we have the description from the Week's News in London, December 21st, 1872, which says that the graham crackers were baked hard and dry like a sea biscuit, and we found it necessary to moisten and soften them before eating. So what we have is Graham really going back to this tradition of whole grains or nearly whole grain. He's going 100% whole grain, but in generally a wheatier, more grain-filled biscuit. I'm going to be running through these biscuits now really quickly because they're beautiful. This is from 1898. It has a stamp on it. It's written on it. It's a souvenir actually by the 74 New York Volunteers. It's 3x3 hardtack, and it's mailed with a 2-cent stamp to New York. Pretty awesome. This piece of bread went to the South Pole in 1709, 1707, 1709. These pieces of bread went to the Antarctic as well. You can see that some of them are round, some of them are square. This woman here is making a lot of biscuits. This is a biscuit factory around the era of World War I. This biscuit says the reason why a soldier has to have good teeth. It was sent back to Australia by Lieutenant Eric Harding China. He was killed in action in 1917, but he sent this biscuit back. It's pretty amazing. Here's another World War I British biscuit. Here's a World War I German biscuit. You can see the Kaiser's mark on it. It's government property. Here's a World War I French biscuit and its tin container. Here's World War I American biscuits. We call it hard bread. It looks a lot like hard tack. It's in they're 2x2, and again, they come in their own tin container. By 1741, the U.S. Army changes its rations to Army Ration B. You can see prominently are large, what we might just call sea biscuits. Right there in the middle.
We're very happy.
Oh my God.
We're very happy.
That's what you said.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Ability, taking it home.
Sorry. Hold on. Somebody needs to be muted.
Okay, so the rations for World War II, American rations. Here we go. Let me,
Dan, you're hot micing.
okay, can you hear me now, William?
Yes.
Okay, so K rations, again, crackers. We changed it somehow. Okay. I'm stuck. Oh, here we go. So these are the crackers in modern MREs. This here is what I would consider to be the first hardtack to make it outside of our planet. Buzz Aldrin took communion wine and communion wafers to the moon. And before he stepped out on the moon, he had his own communion ceremony. So this was the first bread and the first wine eaten outside of our planet. And of course, still the International Space Station has crackers. All right, so that's the history of biscuits where we're at. Now, let's just run through this. Here's the research of what might make sense for some, and for the rest of you, I'm hoping that you find it interesting. The wheat grain is like an avocado. You have a hard outer shell, a mushy middle, and like a little seed inside. The wheat grain, we tend to think of it as being separated into 3 parts. the endosperm, the husk, the bran, the germ, which is where you have your vitamins, and then you have your endosperm, which is where the flour comes from. And that's true, but there's very many different layers to a kernel of wheat. You get to them by milling them. On the left is a stone ground mill, and on the right is what we call a roller mill. We all generally are eating roller milled flour if we buy it from the grocery store, unless it says stone ground. Those two milling processes lead to two different entire types of flour.
Jeff?
When we sift flour commercially today, we break it down, we sift it, it gets bolted and separated. Most of that flour goes to what we consider like our commercial flours, but about 20 to 25 to 30% of it is something that gets reduced and is called Short's bran and germ, or feed.
Jeff?
Yes.
Do you hear us? We're hearing an echo. There wasn't echo before. Has something changed in your setup?
I think if you mute the cell phone or the second device.
Yeah, okay, when I mute I'm gonna mute this one, thank you. Oh, I see. But the cell phone got muted. Let's try that. So this middle grain is what we call middlings.
No, Jeff, you muted yourself.
Okay. How's that? Is that better? Can you hear me now? Yes. Okay.
Still the echo.
So this middle grain is what is not grain.
Jeff,
this ground grain is not flour.
echoing.
It's everything else. It's about 25 to 30%. They break it down. We have our wheat bran, our flour, our germ, but we also have things called full run, middling, shorts, and red dog. These are all commercial terms used today, but they were known in the 18th century. One description says that the various names were given to this sort of roughly ground fourths, middlings, pollard, and shift stuff. Jonas Hanaway in 1766 says another sort of flour which biscuits and gingerbread bakers use should be coarse flour.
Jeff,
in
you're
1774.
still
Yes.
echoing.
Oh, I'm sorry. How's that? Better?
Still
Better?
echoing.
Don't know.
If you turn the volume down, perhaps that might help on the second device.
Okay, let me do that. Thank you. That's a great idea. Okay. Let's try that. How's that?
It's worse. Can't you go back to what you were doing before?
I don't know why it changed. If I mute this computer, then I can't change the screen.
Well, you're on the participant screen twice.
Yeah, I have two computers going.
Can you mute the computer that you're not using the audio for?
Yeah, I turned it all the way down. It's not letting me change if I do that.
Okay, it's much better now. It's much better.
Okay. I'll just have to go back and forth. Okay, so we know that this is called coarse flour. It's something that gingerbread and biscuit bakers make. This coarse flour, this is gingerbread that's actually made with coarse flour, or what we call biscuit stuff. This is a 18th century recipe, and you can see its coarseness inside. This is actually based off an original press, and this is called red gingerbread from the mid 18th century. And the flour used in this is this coarse middlings, coarse flour.
Can you talk about those baskets, Jeff?
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out how to move the screen. If I unmute that, it's just not moving. Move. come on. Okay, well, those baskets are, okay, well, we can do that. So these baskets are ways of sifting. In modern times, we have all kinds of modern sifters that we use. This whole sifting idea goes back to who knows how long. We know that that even in the Roman era, there was white bread and wheat bread. So they must have been sifting out the differences of this coarser flour. This our group member Tony put this together. He took 100 grams of red wheat berry and then sifted it. 100% extraction, 75% extraction, meaning the 25% of the bran and germ are taken out. The flour is 75%. We oftentimes would call that wheaten flour. And then what we might call white flour in the time period would be about 50-50. That you would take 50% of the coarser meal out and leave 50% of the fine flour, 50% extraction. These flour dressers were there. Like, this is invented in the mid 1600s. They had technology to do this. The important part about the technology is that they had to standardize what it meant to bolt flour. So this was a document from a report from 1774 to Parliament about flour and milling and sifting. And what we see is they say that the S means a shilling or a shilling cloth. So and then they correspond that to what they were doing at the time, where they started taking from cloth bolters to wire bolters. So this wire bolter goes back several hundred years to the mid 18th century. We determine what we're sifting through by the numbers of wires per square inch. This tells us that a cloth that's, say, 14 shillings is 40 by 36, which we would call now a 40 mesh screen, or 425 microns. So we can correspond what they are milling and what they are sifting out to their shilling cloth, and now we can. But we didn't know what the shilling cloth meant. Like, what did that mean? Well, this means that we know that a 40 shilling screen, shilling cloth is 40 by 36. That's the equivalency in wire, which is much more standard than cloth. We can take that information and we can understand that when we're bolting flour and we put it in that machine that we showed you, the meshes that are at the front are 100 mesh, down to 50 mesh, down to 30 mesh. As you bolt that flour through, you're getting finer particles coming through. So your 100 mesh screen flour is your super fine flour. Your 50 mesh is your fine and your middlings. Your 30 mesh is your middlings and your shorts. And because it's at an angle, the bran starts just moving towards the end. It's light and fluffy. It just kind of keeps moving. This idea of the angle is something new to me that I just noticed in this new research. And there's something to this angle of bolting. We tend to bolt flour back and forth horizontally. But if you look at a lot of these bolters, these old ones, they're horizontal. So the bran, I think, had centrifugal force. These things were spinning, and it was actually just kind of getting sucked out the end. And this particular mill kind of shows that beautifully. Biscuits, that's what we're talking about. How do we figure this out? We have to first bolt our flour, and we know that these bolters have several different screens in them. The divisions of the screens are listed as numbers of wires per square inch. If we take one of their experiments and break it down, we can read that the machines are for dressing biscuit stuff are composed of the following wire works. We're looking at a 35 inch screen, or 600 microns, a 42 of 425 microns, or a 24, an 800 micron screen. And they say very clearly you can design that the number of wires are an inch long, inch broad. In that regards, the number describes, for instance, number 60 has 60 wires in an inch, both length and breadth. So we know that they are standardizing what we now call a 60 mesh screen. And in order to get this biscuit stuff, they're using 35, 30 mesh, 40 mesh, and 20 mesh screens. So they're going for those larger sizes to get that particular type of flour out of their grinding. They take a 30 shilling or 13 shilling or 30 micron, 30 mesh, and they run it through. They bolt it all this flour. They measure it. They get 45 pounds per bushel. They take out in their 3 experiments 24, 28, and 24% bran. That's a pretty good percentage of, because when we're looking at what we consider to be flour, wheat and flour, we're looking at 75% extraction. So they're extracting out that very obvious 25% of bran that sits on top. They then re-sifted that flour and broke it down using 20, 18, 16, and 13 shilling cloths, which corresponds to 30, 40, 50, and 60 mesh. The percentage of flour they were able to get out was, they were able to get out the majority of it being household flour. I think they're mistaken. They call it household, which generally meant whole grain flour, unsifted or barely sifted. I think because they'd already sifted out of the bran, this would now, I would consider this wheat and flour. But then they're looking at the seconds, third, middlings, and pullers. They're getting 15% of whatever was extra that they weren't planning on selling out, and they're selling it to the biscuit maker. Nowadays, we sell it to the feed store. Because I have a friend that has a mill, works for the city of Holland, Michigan. They have a windmill. It's the only windmill that's left the Netherlands and brought to North America. It still works. It's beautiful. This was a pound of biscuit flour. I sifted it through, first of all, the 20 mesh screen. This here is the 20 mesh, the 20 mesh shorts or biscuit stuff that comes out of it. But if we go for the 30, we see that it has a longer bran, and we get about 4% of it. This made up about almost 50%. We can find the finer flours that come out at 40. And at 50, we get even smaller particles. These are particles that we generally don't search out. But when she sifts her flour, she's taking out the amount that she needs to make her 75% wheat and flour. The rest is what she calls biscuit stuff. You can still buy in some mills that are stone ground mills a flour called biscuit stuff. It's this middling, it's this other stuff. And this, she tends to have a lot of white flour in it. This was also the end of the bag of my last pound. So I think a lot of the white flour honestly fell through. I think this percentage would be lower if I got other flour. In comparison, this from her same windmill, from her same ground mill, is 1 pound of what she would call her wheat and flour. You can see that there's some specks of bran. It's not white. It has a nice hue to it. It's very light and fluffy. It's soft wheat. When you sift this pound through, you're coming out with these very small particles of other things that you can extract to see what percentage they are and if they correspond to what they're finding in the 18th century. And sure enough, the 20 still has some of that light bran to it. And then the 30, 40, and 50, you can still, whoop, there goes that. You can still extract these other small particles or pullers that you might call it. And then out of it, you get a percentage of white flour. The biscuit maker was not just using whole wheat flour. They weren't just using random flour. They were using the specific refuse of the milling process and reutilizing it to make ship bread for sailors and armies and civilians that wanted bread that lasted a long time. Because they were using this very particular flour that would have been just fed to animals, it allowed for another source of income. In fact, I have a document from George Washington where he says, take the ship stuff and sell it for what it's worth. Meaning, it's worth something, go and sell it. This is what I just showed you, the 20, 30, 40, 50 mesh screens. The difference between soft wheat mill and the top one is your coarse flour. That's what the bran flakes look like. The bottom shows you what she would have kept. That would be the bran that was in her wheat and flour. That's the bran that you would have regularly wanted. But it's long flakes, longer, not as long as the original long bran. It's shorter than that, but it's not as small or coarse as the ship's flour. These are the biscuit recipes I showed you, and here is the final recipe. So what I did was I showed you all these different recipes. The one thing I try to explain, if you want to just go the most simple route, is get a flour sifter. If you have a sifter, go ahead and sift out a bunch of the wheat flour. And what you're going to be left with is you're extracting all this long bran. This long bran is what no one wanted in their biscuit. It attracts water, it holds water. It's not good to maintain a biscuit with long bran. So just sift your flour and you'll be that much closer to a better biscuit. The biscuit that I organized for my use, the closest I can get without owning a mill is I take whole kernels of soft white wheat berries. I put them in a coffee grinder and I mill them for about 30 seconds or so until they are coarse and ground. This does not emulate exactly ship stuff, but it does give you a very coarse, ground, small, granular pieces of flour. There's flour in here. You can extract the white flour out of it, but honestly, a lot of it just has that coarseness to it that the biscuit flour does, except for the biscuit flour is softer. So I also add to it whole wheat flour, some white wheat flour, which gives it a little bit of the white grain and a little bit more of the texture that this doesn't have, as well as I add pastry flour. The pastry flour lightens up the biscuit because this wheat was soft wheat. And so you lose, just by grinding berries in a coffee grinder, you lose some of the softness of it. So I add pastry flour. The hydration levels are such that if we take so this is number 5, is my hybrid. So if I take about 56% hydration, a cup of water plus 2 tablespoons, you can easily measure this out. But honestly, the amount of water, you're going to reduce it. So I can probably hit, yeah, I'm good here within my amount of water. So I'm just going to take the 3 flours, my white wheat, my pastry, and my pseudo biscuit stuff, add the water, and then you're just going to mix it together until it comes together into a hard dough. If you have a hard time with this, then add more water. If it's too thin, it's going to be a pain. You want it to be a higher, you want it to be a lower hydration bread. It should be kind of thick. This here generally turns into somewhat of a paste until it sets. When we let it set, it hydrates, and then we'll be able to roll it out. Once you roll it out, you want to make sure that you divide it equally. For this process, I generally divide it at 5 ounces, 1/4, because I still use this balance scale. I don't use digital scales. When they're fully dry, they'll be down to about just over 3 ounces. So these are still a touch heavy. If we can see that, I can't see myself. So you can say that these are just still a touch heavy. When I have 5 of them, these are just 5 different varieties. It should equal a pound. It's heavy right now. I made these on Monday. Sorry. So we still have for each biscuit about a 1/2 ounce of water still left that needs to evaporate. So give it another couple of days, and these will balance out to 1 pound. But generally, that's what you're looking for. A hard, crisp biscuit that you can break maybe with your hands, and then you can soak it in water and eat. All right. These are just 2 fun images to end with. Any questions?
Jeff,
Yes.
I have a question. So, in addition to just dipping it in water or coffee, do you have any suggestions for recipes that we could cook the ship's biscuit with and kind of approximate something a sailor might have eaten?
For sure. If you type in Lobkoos, Lobsquouse, it's a huge genre of food, and it really just means like what we have available, right? So we might have some vegetables, we might not. We might have some meat. You'll find Lobkoos in all these different cultures. You'll find like Lobkoos from the Scandinavian countries, including random fish, even walruses in some of the older recipes. You'll see them using salted beef, salted pork, and then you are allowing it to make it into a stew. And then you're taking those biscuits and breaking them up and putting them in the stew and letting them soak up. The easiest one that most people know is New England chowder. That it has as its basis this idea of putting bread in it as its filler. So either one of those is really kind of the easiest culinary entrance to using hard bread in your food.
Before we get more questions, because we've got 4 minutes until it's officially over. So I'm going to leave the meeting on so you can keep asking questions. I'd like everyone to, first of all, unmute yourselves and give Jeff a fabulous applause. This was brilliant, absolutely brilliant.
Thanks.
Thank you, Jeff.
Applause in real life.
Thank you.
William, can I just ask, is there a way that Jeff, we could sort of message Jeff, can we message you separately to ask a few questions? Because I unfortunately have to go, but there are a couple of things that I really want burning to talk to you about.
Yeah, I'll put my chat. I'll put my email in the chat right now.
And do you mind if we contact you personally?
Yes.
You mind?
And I just want to say that, I mean, Jeff, that was absolutely brilliant. And it really is this bringing bread history alive and bringing the past alive. Just brilliant analysis, brilliantly presented, brilliant synthesis. I'm really impressed with what you did with that flower document. I mean, the whole thing is just fabulous. I mean,
well, thank you for hosting it. There's not a lot of places in the world you get to do this, right?
That's true.
We shut the bakery down for 3 weeks after the holidays. We shut the bakery down so we could all take a long winter's nap. And I've had the best of times throwing myself back into the stacks of research papers that I had collected, things that I hadn't re-looked at. You and I were talking about a paper that you hadn't yet been able to bring forth, and I'd already used it in my research, but I looked at it very differently than you did. So there was a lot of great collaboration and looking at just ways of taking a lot of our bread knowledge. I feel like we've made a couple interesting leaps in doing this in the last couple of weeks. So it's been a fantastic collaborative process.
I think so. And, I'm always being didactic, so I apologize, but I would like to call out a couple things that I thought were particularly brilliant. One was the way that you analyzed those charts, and that's massively valuable. I have sort of done that, but not as clearly as you did. And I think for everyone who's reading in this historic period, when he pulled out that Civil War document and noticed the difference between thin, thick, and just, without an adjective, just plain, plus the biscuit. That's the kind of teasing out information between the cracks. And it's just fabulous. As it's about to end, what else to say? It just was all really great. And Tony's slide that he lent you, made for you, that is also really, really, really brilliant. And I like this collaboration between you and Tony and the other Tony. Anyone else who wants to give a talk in the future, this is what you have to match. This level. Well, Tony, Shahan also was really, really good. So
I did tell you, William, that this was my chosen career, to be an interpreter and to talk history at a museum or in a park and to give presentations like this. I worked for the National Park Service and did presentations like this. So I wouldn't, this is definitely a niche for me and something that I hold as like this is kind of like what I like to do. So I wouldn't expect this to be for everybody's passion in the same manner, but we all can learn from each other somehow.
No, it's brilliant work, and I think it really advances the field. It really does. We just have to think of what to do. It is 1/2 We're going to keep it open. So I know there's someone, Samuel Challen has a question. We'll keep it open. I have secretly on my other computer made a link for a Zoom meeting on Sunday at 9 a.m. Pacific. I will send that out tonight to everyone for helping to organize. We'll just talk for an hour. If you can't come, we'll talk specifically. I've got lots of ideas for myself, but I really think let's pull also from this group and from your friends because I think the great gift COVID has given us is Zoom and the chance to create these communities.
William, can you put those emails on that email about the recipe testing so that we can all get in touch with you if we need to?
And I'll do that also. I'll put the Melinda Russell also, and it's also going to be on my Facebook Bread History group. So with that, again, can't thank you enough, Jeff. That's a massive amount of work, brilliantly synthesized.